In the previous video, I showed how to install the intake components, the intake manifold, and the carburetor using the induction system alignment bracket or tool that Harley used to make. But this tool really is not necessary for the job at all. And as a matter of fact, it introduces a bit of an issue of its own in the sense that it's not really a fault of the tool, because you can see here that it's got two machine surfaces that are supposed to mate with these two datum surfaces on the heads. And the whole idea behind the tool is to align the induction components with these, or square them with these two surfaces, so they don't get out of alignment themselves. Also, what also happens is that the carburetor is maintained relatively level, and we all know that it is a good idea to keep the carb level, because the fuel level in the flow bowl actually determines how rich or lean the mixture is throughout the operating range. But at any rate, so let me show you something with this tool. It's an interesting observation. So if I press this ear against this datum surface of the front cylinder and I rotate the tool up, you will see that there's a pretty good gap between the left ear and this datum surface of the rear cylinder. But if I do the opposite here and press this ear against this datum surface and I rotate the right ear up, there's barely any interference between the tool and this datum surface. And so what this leads me to conclude is that these two surfaces are not in plane, and as a matter of fact, there's a small angle between them. And the reason this happens is because, you know, these are individual cylinders. When they're installed, they can be rotated a little bit, a couple of degrees above the axis. So these surfaces will not necessarily be in the same plane. The brackets that we have, they're probably quite a bit less precise when they're manufactured than the tool that Harley used to provide, but since you don't have great precision here, the lack of precision in the bracket is probably not the worst thing. As long as we maintain the induction system essentially square with these two surfaces, we should be fine. And how do you check square? Well, that's really simple. You can just use an angle finder. So you can see if I check this datum surface here, I have about 90 degrees. If I check this datum surface here, we see 90 degrees, and of course the motorcycle is upright and level. The front end of the bike is a little bit higher than the rear just because it's sitting in a chalk. Another thing we can do is check, and this is not really important because the bracket is going to take care of the clocking of the carburetor this way, but just to see that we match what was intended by the tool, what we can do is we can check the angle front to back between the datum surfaces, and that's easy enough. Just use a little level like this and use our angle finder. And what I'm seeing here is an angle between 4 and 5 degrees. So these are the requirements essentially. This is exactly what we would get if we mounted the carburetor and the intake manifold using the Harley tool. So let's install our carburetor and the carburetor support bracket and see if we actually get these same specs. So as I mentioned in the previous video, the intake manifold has quite a bit of play. So there's play up and down, and a little bit side to side as well. So that's going to allow for any imperfection in the bracket. But the brackets are generally made so that this plane and this plane are parallel planes. So we should be in good shape as far as the requirement of squareness is concerned. Again, let's install the carb. And so the idea is to install the carburetor all the way into the gasket. It's not going to go metal to metal because of the way the gasket is made. There's always a little bit of a gap between this metallic surface and the internal lip of the manifold. Okay, now the carburetor's all the way in. So we're going to grab our bracket, install the screws. And as I mentioned before, there is the air filter base, or the air cleaner base here that receives the air filter. We don't need it right now. This is just, again, we're just trying to see if our bracket is fitting properly and spaced properly. Okay, so before I install this guy, I just want to go back and talk about the other bracket that we try to use. And you know, even without the tool, we can just put this thing on and we can see that we have a pretty good gap between the carburetor and this bracket. So there's no gasket that we can use to fill this gap. So this bracket is just not going to work for us because these legs right here are too long. And there's nothing we can do. We can't move the carburetor anymore out. And if we do, we're going to start basically pulling the carb out of that gasket, and that's going to decrease the insertion depth and possibly cause an air leak later. So this bracket, even though it's a nice bracket, we can't use on this particular bike. So this bracket has much shorter ears, or these legs are shorter. I'm not tightening these all the way because I might need the little bit of play that we have here as well when I line the ears up. So, but what I can tell you right now is that there's a little bit of a gap here and a little bit of a gap on this side, but it's tiny. So this is actually a good thing because I can press the entire assembly in and just a little bit, so I know I'm not going to have any leaks. So the length of these legs is just right for this particular application. So what I'm going to do now is install these centering spacers to make sure that the bracket doesn't move up and down too much and I can actually support the carburetor. And this point I can tighten these screws up. Okay, so now I'm going to tighten up the intake manifold screws, and then we're going to pull the bracket off and actually take our measurements. I mean, I can take the measurements with the bracket on. So let's tighten everything up now. In the previous video, I mentioned that this little ratchet with the extension and 1/4-inch hex is going to be able to tighten up the screws on this side of the manifold. And I forgot that this carburetor at this moment does not have the cable bracket. So yes, I can reach this screw with this setup, but if the bracket is in place, I will not be able to reach the other screw. So the tool that I have for this are actually two different tools you can use, you know. So again, these are made from a hex key, just cut off different lengths bits. And now, by the way, the reason that I have these things marked with silver paint is because sometimes it's difficult to tell when you're putting them in whether or not they have bottomed out in the fastener, right? And so this is kind of just a visual aid for me to see, because if you just insert it a little bit and you don't bottom it out, it's very easy to damage the socket head. So you have a choice. You can use this one or a longer one. It's just kind of a different approach. If you're using the shorter one, you have to go in from the bottom. So this is a gear wrench ratchet. So let me go in from the bottom like this. Okay, so I'll tighten this one up. And just to show you the alternative approach, you have a longer one of these. So this one you would have to go in from the top. It's always a good idea to put the ratchet on right away. Okay, so you can see this is a setup right here. So that's how I would tighten it, like that. So it's a little bit easier. Now you're reaching in from the top. Now I'm going to finish tightening all the screws. Okay, so all our screws are now tight. Let's take the bracket off and check our measurements to make sure that the carburetor is installed in the position that it should be installed, and essentially matches the installation if we use the Harley tool. Let's take some measurements. So we're looking for 90 degrees here. There you go, there's 90 degrees, and between 4 and 5 degrees here. Here you go. So as you can see, we've done a great job without the tool. The tool is not really needed. Again, all we need is that we maintain the face of the carburetor essentially parallel with these datum surfaces, and then the bracket is going to take care of the clocking so that the float bowl remains pretty level. One quick thing I also wanted to show you is, just in case if you have a bracket with really short legs here, and I made this myself, just welded, cut and welded and made it shorter. If you put this against the carb, you see you have a pretty big gap now on the other side. Before, when we had the legs too long, because then there's just nothing you can do. Here, you can shim the bracket from the back, and one way to do it, for example, is the kit that I demonstrated in the previous video. You just have these centering washers, and then you have another washer that the centering washer goes into. Just put this on the back. And now you have your spacing this way. So that's pretty much how to install a carburetor without leaks. I don't remember whether I mentioned this or not, but when I do the actual installation, all the rubber surfaces are going to receive a coating of this easy turn lubricant. It's a high temperature sealing grease, really excellent stuff, used quite a bit on various fuel components, and it's also an anti-seize. So, but at the same time, what it does is just kind of seals things together. It's almost like a glue, so it's very, very thick and kind of difficult to get off. So that's pretty much the procedure. Thanks for watching.